Hi, this is Mrs. White to talk to you today about Chapter 6, Communities and Ecosystem Dynamics, specifically covering Section 6.2, which goes over biodiversity, ecosystems, and resilience. Let's first talk about the different types of biodiversity. So, biodiversity is just the total of all of the genetically based variation in all organisms in the environment, which can include plants, animals, and microorganisms, as well as the ecosystems, the species, and the genetic diversity. So starting off with the community or the ecosystem biodiversity. This is the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes in the biosphere. Species diversity refers to the number of different species in a biome and the ecosystems or the habitat. And genetic diversity is about all of the different forms of genes that are present within a population. So on the top right here is an example of an ecosystem biodiversity example, because what we see is one ecosystem, and then within that ecosystem we see different abiotic and biotic factors. In terms of the biotic factors, we see lots of different types of producers. We see in here lots of different first level consumers. We see second level consumers, and we don't see necessarily third level consumers, but they could be in there. We have different insects, different marine animals, land animals, lots and lots of different types of life. So we can see that there are a lot of different or lots of diversity within that ecosystem, which is very, very important. In species diversity here, we have, and it actually sounds very similar to ecosystem diversity, but we're actually looking at more specifically like just a few living things. In community 1, we see that there are a lot of different types of species of trees. In community 2, however, we see that there is not as much diversity. So when we talk about species diversity, we're looking at an area, and then within that area figuring out, are there lots of different types of species, or are they only limited in terms of maybe only one or two within that population? Last but not least, for that genetic diversity example here, this is not something you would see with your eyes necessarily, and we'll talk about genes much more in semester 2. But for now, just keep in mind that this would be inside and something you would have to actually calculate within a scientific lab. Now, when there is a ton of variation, we know that when populations spread out, lots of different genes are out there. And as you have different types of genes, we will see as time goes on that that allows for better survival. Now, in terms of the benefits of biodiversity, this includes offering invaluable contributions to medicine and agriculture and enabling organisms and ecosystems to adapt to the environments that change. In terms of medicine, many were discovered in wild plant species, and we even have compounds that have been taken from nature to help treat diseases like cancer. In terms of agriculture, wild crops often carry genes that can improve the resistance to disease or pests and can then be transferred to the crops that we have modified over the years and have made not necessarily grow out in nature anymore, but have modified them. And we can then take those wild crop genes and actually, through genetic engineering, put them into our crops, and then that way have new crops pop up that can be resistant to things like disease. We also know in terms of resilience that resilient ecosystems can adapt over time to change. And when you're lacking biodiversity, you really are lacking that ability to bounce back from situations that can essentially annihilate a species in total. Now, in the model above, we know that the red species right here, let me zoom in, the red species has a better tolerance to a wet weather environment, while the gold has a better tolerance to a dry weather environment. Now, ecosystems that contain just one might have a really dramatic change when those are both there, and then the lack of the biodiversity can actually affect the resilience of the ecosystem in total. And so we can see here, when you have a diverse ecosystem on an average year versus a wet year versus a dry year, more survive overall. However, those that survive better in the wet environment are going to be annihilated in the dry, and then those that survive best in the dry will be annihilated in the wet year. And so having all of that diversity allows a species to continue on and pass on those genes and not go extinct. In terms of the genetic diversity, I just wanted to show you this one here. This is just such a perfectly beautiful example here. This is the wild South American potatoes that are visible. And we say wild because they're just not like the ones that we mass produce on farms. But they have actually a hidden genetic diversity that is really important for us. And if the Irish farmers had planted a wider diversity of potatoes instead of just a single variety, then the potato famine might not have been so devastating, because when you're mass producing just one type of crop, then unfortunately when something happens like drought and those crops are not resistant to drought or not drought tolerant, then they all get wiped out and then your food sources are wiped out. So variation is key to survival. Now, the health and the diversity of ecosystems provides vital benefits to humans. And although that isn't necessarily the biggest and most important thing for everybody, because humans are just one of obviously millions of species on Earth, it is something that does affect us, as we are human and we are the ones that are making such dramatic changes to our environment, and then the ones that can actually help fix some of those changes. So there's lots of different ways. In terms of food production, we have the diversity, which provides lots of food for livestock, for animals, and for marine ecosystems, which can then provide us with food. In terms of nutrient cycling, it keeps our soil healthy, which is extremely important, because the next one is soil structure. And we know that healthy soil is essentially the only way that we're going to have fertility in the land. Let me just fix that one little typo. All right, in terms of purifying water, so now we have soil that's healthy. That healthy soil will lead to fertility, and then that fertility will bring us plants, algae, and fungi, which we know will help keep the soil in place, and it will filter and clean the water. In terms of storing carbon, we know that organisms that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere can store carbon and are extremely necessary for survival. We have pollinating crops, super important. Bees, flies, butterflies help pollinate our fruits and vegetables and allow us to have all of the yummy and various different types of food sources that give us the nutrients that we need to survive. In terms of regulating pests, predators that feed on the pests keep those populations in check, so very important. And in terms of buffering effects of extreme weather events, wetlands, for example, protect against erosion and protect shorelines from storms, and things like diverse forests actually protect mountainsides from erosion and landslides. Hopefully some of this is clicking based on that portion of the documentary Saw, the Biggest Little Farm, where we saw a lot of this play out and could see in very clear terms how much all of this is interconnected with each other. Last but not least, measuring and preserving biodiversity. So we've gotten to the point now where we talked about why all of this is important, and now we're going to talk about how can we make sure that we keep this in check for future generations. So first of all, how do you measure biodiversity? Well, the simplest way is to measure it through species richness, which describes how many species live in an area. And there is something called relative species abundance, which is just counting the number of individuals of a species present. So in terms of this picture here, zoom in for a moment. All right. These hypothetical communities have almost the same number of species, but one of them has significant higher biological diversity. Okay. And ignoring the rest of that here, just looking at the two pictures, you can see that even though maybe the number of living things is the same, the differences in the types that we're seeing is hugely important. Okay. Next up, how do we conserve it? Well, we want to focus to preserve and protect natural resources, ranging from individual species to an entire ecosystem, to biodiversity, to the ecosystem services. And all of this can be done through a number of different ways. And these are just some of the ways that our book highlights, but remember that this is not the only list possible. There is definitely more opportunities and ways that humans can help conserve biodiversity. So starting off with protecting individual species. A great example is the California condor. It was almost completely extinct. It was at the brink of extinction. And we have captive breeding programs that bred and raised those young animals until they were able to survive in the wild. And this actually helped get their numbers back up again. We have something called an indicator species, which helps give an early warning system to determine essentially if there's a problem in the ecosystem. So for example, we have lichen, which is like, it looks like green moss. It grows on trees. And we know that some of that lichen is sensitive to heavy metals or acid rain or fog. And so therefore their presence or their lack of a presence on a tree can then be really useful for tracking the air and the rain quality. In terms of preserving ecosystems, we know we can create sanctuaries, national parks, and forests to protect large areas of land. We know that preventing habitat loss and fragmentation is extremely important, and that is because we need to be conscious of where we build, and in the future, as we build, to not disrupt nature itself. We can, if we're fragmenting land, meaning like we're separating the natural path, for example, those panda videos we saw, we're separating that natural path where they might have to cross to get to their mates. And now if you have built a freeway there, they can't do that. And so there are ways around that. That's to obviously be conscious of the future type of building, but we can also add in things like natural bridges to help fix fragmentation, where we create pathways for animals to safely get across the different interference, like a freeway, that humans have built. In terms of habitat restoration, damage can be fixed in some cases, not all, but it can be fixed. And that can be done by creating conditions that resemble the ecosystem before it was disrupted. For example, in terms of wetlands, we've oftentimes filled those in to help build on top of them. And so what we can do is really simple. We can remove the material that humans have filled them in with, and then allow nature to take its course to try to rebuild those areas. In terms of identifying biodiversity hotspots, we know that given the limited resources we have, ecosystems that are home to many species found nowhere else are really important. And so if that habitat is in immediate danger, what we can do, and let me get this a little bit higher, what we can do then is call it a hotspot. Okay, and so if we look here, Conservation International identifies biodiversity hotspots using 2 criteria. The area number 1 must contain at least 1,500 species of native vascular plants, and it must have lost at least 70% of its original habitat. The hotspots shown here just cover 2.3% of the Earth's land surface, but they contain over 50% of the world's plant species and 42% of the terrestrial vertebrates, meaning not in the water, on land. So you can see that even though it may not be a lot of land area, these hotspots are important because a lot of life lives in those very tiny portions of land. And if we can save those portions and conserve those portions, we can then conserve biodiversity. Thank you guys for joining me for section 6.3.